Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to our second lecture on the Greek and Roman historians, in which we are going to start exploring the awakening of the Greek historical spirit, particularly in the world of epic and myth. The Homeric epics are the fountainhead of that great stream of development, which by the 5th century BC was to produce written drama, scientific treatises, philosophy, and history. The Iliad and the Odyssey are, to be sure, none of these. They are poetry, alike in outward form and in inward spirit. Although a student of modern historiography would give such material no place, we will not find it easy to expel the epics entirely, for to do so, one must give battle to a determined school of thought, which treats them as almost divinely inspired true history. That school of thought existed, of course, in antiquity. Now, in reality, Homer did not intend to write history, and the mental attitude exhibited in his tales is far removed from that of the historian. This is a conclusion that I will justify in a moment at some length, because it admirably illustrates the unhistorical inheritance of later Greek thought. But this is not all which one must say about the epics and their cousins, the myths. Since the Greeks did eventually develop a historical outlook, intellectual seeds capable of growth in this direction must be found lurking in the epic genre, however inconsistent their presence may be with its primary character. Now, we no longer discuss early Greece simply as the Homeric age, as was once the custom, say, in scholarship up until 100 years ago or so, because the evidence grows that, and has grown, that not all the cultural and economic developments in this era, and what we're talking about here is roughly 1100 BC to roughly 700 BC, not all of the cultural and economic developments in this era were of purely native Greek origin. By the 8th century BC, the Greeks were in contact with the far more developed Near Eastern societies, which had earlier stimulated the Minoan and Mycenaean worlds. And this link had almost been entirely shattered during the great upheavals, the migrations of peoples, and the general decline in culture that took place at the end of the second millennium, at the end of the Bronze Age. When the ties between Greece and the Near East were resumed, they drew the Near East and Greece ever closer, and finally the Persian Empire tried to conquer European Greece, which of course is the subject of the first great history written by a Greek, Herodotus. What I'd like to do right now is to turn from local Greek progress to consider also the extent to which the Near East may have offered models in the field of historiography. And this detour will have an unexpected profit as regards the spur which led to historical writing. However much the essential roots of Greek historiography must found to lie within Hellenic civilization itself. Nevertheless, no history had yet been written in the Greek world by 700 BC, which is the close of the first phase of Greek civilization, what is oftentimes referred to as the Dark Ages of ancient Greece. Again, that period of time between the collapse of Bronze Age civilization and, say, 1100 BC down to 700, at which point the Archaic period is said to begin. In looking at the world of epic and myth, we can easily see why this was so, that no history was written during that time. The Greeks had a long road to traverse in passing from the unhistorical perspective to the historical perspective on the world. Beginning then with Homer and the question of history. The Iliad and the Odyssey were tales laid in a distant past, the era of the Trojan War. This we today consider to have been the late Mycenaean period, sometime, let's say, in the 13th century. The traditional kind of end point or destruction point of Troy is somewhere in the 1180s BC. Almost everything else in Homeric scholarship has been and continues to be the subject of fierce debate. And this period is therefore one in which the epics were being put together in the form in which later ages would have known them. But of course, we do know that Homeric bards continued to recite and revise and rework the Homeric material for even centuries after this. Much of the material was of an ancient inheritance, and the Homeric dialect and poetic techniques that are found inside of the Iliad and the Odyssey were of entirely artificial constructions. The dialect itself is what is known in German as a Kunstsprach, that is an artificial language or a dialect only for literature. And these constructions, this dialect and so on, were elaborated over many generations. It is very controversial, but a reasonable guess as to the final crystallization of the epics is that the Iliad was finally written down somewhere towards the very end of the 8th century BC, say around 700 or so, and the Odyssey slightly later. It was believed throughout most of the 20th century that 750 was kind of the normal date for the writing down of the Iliad and the Odyssey by around 700, but the tendency by scholars nowadays is to move that slightly later. In any event, these two epics were definitely by different authors, which is another way of saying that there is no Homer. Homer was simply a name given to these poems, but they certainly were not by the same person. Again, a point that has been much debated, but most scholars, I think, would agree with that nowadays. However, the similarity in style and language and the outlook that is in them, although it is different between the two poems, is similar enough that one may continue to employ the term Homer as a collective noun for the kind of whoever it was who gave the final stamp to both of these poems. Whenever composed, the Homeric epics were first and last poetry. Homer certainly felt that the events he recounted had actually taken place, but his aim was not simply to rehearse the Trojan War or the travels of Odysseus as recitals of pure fact. The opening lines of the Iliad clearly announce that that epic will revolve around the wrath of Achilles and the consequences for the Achaean army, and still more for Achilles himself. Had the epics been simply historical treatises, they would have long since suffered the fate of those later epics of the Trojan cycle, which did, in a sense, try to historicize the epic tradition by telling what came before and after the Iliad. But as sympathetic explorations of the human character, and as tales of adventure, to say nothing of their purely poetic genius, the Iliad and the Odyssey have captured the imagination of generation after generation of minds from their first inception in very early antiquity, right on up until the modern day age, when there are still modern resettings of these poems. One thinks, for instance, of James Joyce's famous novel, Ulysses, which is a kind of resetting of the story of the Odyssey in turn of the century Dublin, or even of the very much more recent film "Oh Brother, Where Art Thou" by by the Coen brothers with George Clooney in it. Apart from the obvious fact that Homer was a poet, the principal proof that he did not intend to write history lies perhaps in the fact that his stories of the past had no direct connection with his own world. For an essential ingredient of the historical outlook is the belief that the past leads into and helps determine the present. But we can go further. The frame of mind of this early period was not one likely to have produced a historical narrative in the sense of a reasoned account of man in time and space. This conclusion rests in part on the general level of society in the Homeric era, a point to which I will return in a moment in connection with the myths, but it can be adequately demonstrated even now from the evidence of the epics themselves. Because as far as space is concerned, Homer knew generally the major districts and sites of the Aegean, sometimes in Mycenaean terms. These appear, for instance, in the Iliad, in the extended catalogs of the Achaean contingents, the so-called Catalogue of Ships in Book 2, lines 44 to 759, and of the Trojan allies, Book 2, lines 816 to 77. But neither directions nor relative locations are very sharply set even within the Aegean. And once Odysseus breaks out of this enclave in the Odyssey into the wide Mediterranean world, we enter with him the realm of pure fairy tale. Oh, despite the fact that many people have tried to retrace Odysseus's route throughout the Mediterranean. Scholars and seamen indeed have tried repeatedly to fit the wanderings of Odysseus to the realities of Mediterranean geography, but the efforts have been faulty in their basic principle, because as a careful student of ancient geography sums up regarding Homer's world, quote, he does what he pleases with a blank slate, end quote. True history, it scarcely needs to be said, does not operate with this kind of fanciful spatial factor. Homer's sense of time, on the other hand, is subjective rather than historical. Even though events proceed in a generally temporal order during the wrath of Achilles in the Iliad, the reader can never be sure how many days precisely elapse as he moves between Mount Olympus and the plain of Troy. In the Odyssey, time becomes even more confused as we follow at one point Telemachus for the first 4 books, then Odysseus for the next several books, and then a whole kind of flashback, from books 9 through 12, and then a resumption of the linear narrative in books 13 through 25. When we finally reach the end of the story with the suitors in Penelope's palace, it all simply does not unfold in any truly historical manner. The very word used for time as an objective phenomenon, chronos, has an almost impressionistic flavor in Homer. In the Iliad, it means an instant, while in the Odyssey, it more often connotes a duration as an empty waiting period. More specifically, but equally subjective, is the word for day, emar, which can be the subject of a sentence, unlike chronos. The term often carries with it the concept of a destiny, a fated time for a hero, such as Hector's, the day of, when he refers to, I know that the day of slavery awaits you after my death, or in the beginning of the Odyssey, we learn that Helios took away the day of returning from Odysseus's comrades. Homer is aware that the past, when one man could lift a stone that 2 men nowadays cannot budge, is different somehow from the present, but he has neither any sense that they are intimately connected nor any desire to speak of the world about him, except in the most general terms of similes to lions, flocks of geese, and other natural phenomena. While the seasons revolve about men, and Odysseus marks as an oddity of the island of Calypso that one does not know the regions of darkness and dawn, change itself is not marked by any clearly conceived yardstick of time. Just as in space, so in time the epics are afloat. Particularly illuminating of this point is Homer's picture of man, for the deeds of heroes are the very stuff of his poetry. The heroes are individualized, though we do not know their physical appearance. They act, and their actions are carefully described. Indeed, they exist only in action inasmuch as they have no inner reflective self-consciousness. To explore Homeric psychology at length would carry us far afield into a tangle of complexities. But the essential point is that the epics provide the first literary expression of a realm of ill-defined and jarring concepts, which had great potential and long afterlife in Greek literature and Western literature in general. The heroes do possess some kind of freedom of will to act as they wish, subject to taking the penalties that the gods may inflict. But far more evident at this early stage is the belief that deeds are divinely inspired and divinely motivated. As I will have occasion to argue later on, a truly historical outlook can exist with the concept that the ultimate responsibility for men's actions lies with the divine. But men must, in such a case, move themselves at least in the immediate sense. They must be secondary causes. In the Homeric epics, the gods do not simply pass decrees on Mount Olympus. They actually come down and talk to Achilles and take human form to mislead Hector to his death, to send fake dreams to people, to confuse them, to do the things they want them to do. And more generally, any Homeric hero who engages in unusual behavior can be said to be directed by his ate, or divine possession, delusion. This is a major factor, in fact, in how Agamemnon explains his ill treatment of Achilles in the opening book. And also, even great deeds are done by Menos, that is divine power. Likewise, one's moira, or fate, is a matter determined by the gods or by an even more impersonal force above and behind the gods. The greatness of poetic insight and warm compassion which produced the Iliad and the Odyssey created masterful human portraits, canonical examples to later Greece. But Homer himself was moved unconsciously in a deeply religious spirit to explain the modes of operation of his heroes. Rational historical reflection is therefore not present, and we should not expect it to be present, really, in a poet. Nevertheless, in reading the epics, one does not sense that deliberate analysis of human nature was a tool anywhere available within this early time in Greece. In poetic techniques, also, Homer operated on a very refined, stylized set of principles. The Homeric hexameter meter, which is what the entirety of the Iliad and Odyssey are written in, is basically one simple line, but it did have variations that could be skillfully marshaled to create a flowing and artistic artifice that of great length, just as 8th century potters at Athens decorated their enormous geometric vases of 5 and 6 feet high, and with a limited number of motifs. Many generations of past bards had created a stock of standardized epithets or descriptive phrases that are known by scholars as formula, and which elaborated the deeds of heroes in shorter works. This is a point of real debate among scholars of Homer, but it is basically agreed upon that there were a lot of shorter works that were then kind of woven together into these vast two poems, the Iliad and the Odyssey, and that, whoever we call Homer extracted from these earlier texts, these earlier works, really oral texts, all of these type scenes and formulas and so on. Yet this stylization and standardization combined to weaken the possibility that Homer could have written historically, even if he had wished so. For even individual duels are cast in a generalized mold, which eliminates the unique particularity of historical reality. Here we approach one of the enduring qualities of the Greek outlook, which was to cause difficulty in applying a thoroughgoing historical perspective, in that true history always must move from specific happenings, you see. But this is the opposite of what we see in Homer, where we see everything kind of fit into more generalized or universal molds. The view of Homer that I'm expressing here has one would maybe kind of say it as these are all the anti-historical aspects of the Homeric epics. And nevertheless, though, what we can find within the Homeric poems are kind of nuggets of historical value from the myths, which stand on a lower plane of artistic development than the epics themselves, but they obey much the same principles of thought. Some students of the Homeric poems even go so far as virtually to assert that the intent of epic poetry and tellers of myth was to preserve historical information. And so it is that archaeologists relate the later building stages of Mycenae to the myths of the daughters of Perseus, or the sons of Atreus. Historians recount the early history of Attica in terms of the Theseus legends. In fact, whole volumes at one point were written resting basically exactly this sort of thing on a gossamer spun out of legend and the weakest of traditions. However, this is a credulity that represents in part a reaction against the hypercriticism that characterized scholarship of Homer in the late 19th century. More recently, we're thinking really kind of primarily in the middle of the 20th century, it became fashionable to reinforce this kind of looking at looking for historical nuggets within the myths because of the decipherment of Linear B. That is the language, the kind of Proto-Greek language that was used during Minoan civilization. And this was seen to kind of help link the world of historical Greece to the mythical world portrayed in Homer's poems. And even in Hellenistic times, that is, in later ancient times, myths were quarried and manipulated to justify current political or cultural attitudes. And, there is the idea of euhemeris, which occurred in the Hellenistic period, that sought to kind of say that all of myth was sort of misremembered history. But we might take a warning from the earliest real historians of Greece itself. Undoubtedly, they were inclined to accept epic and myth as being real testimony of the past. After all, it was the only evidence transmitted to them from earlier times, except for some archaeological things that still remained. Yet they knew that this sort of past was timeless, that it could not be linked to the present. And when they approached it, they did so with an unconscious caution, which reveals their different, basically historical attitude. Herodotus evidently felt that he could trust memories only for the past 2 or 3 generations, for his account rarely reached back further than the mid-6th century. He did cite Homer on occasion, but almost never to prove the truth of an earlier event. Quite to the contrary, he asserted that Homer or some other poet invented the name of ocean and altered the story of Helen for poetic reasons. Thucydides, too, was more inclined to accept epic and myth, though only after he had rationalized it and stripped it away of all supernatural elements. Twice in his opening sections, Thucydides found it difficult to accept details on Homer's authority. The use of mythological examples to prove a point, to warn, or to draw a lesson was a long, well-established literary convention, even in Homeric times, in the Homeric poetry, and it would remain one of the major characteristics of poetry and oratory thereafter. Nevertheless, Aristotle, writing in the 4th century, felt a certain uneasiness in the matter when he advised orators to use historical examples as opposed to mythological ones, since they have really happened. To return to Homer, though, it is likely that some kind of attack on Troy did take place long before the writing down of these poems, and an inherited matrix of poetic invention and elaboration about the event was so set in Homer's day that he was not free to create his epic tales simply out of whole cloth, right? He couldn't just make Troy win the Trojan War or something like that. Nevertheless, as one investigates the evolution of other later epic tales from, say, the medieval times, like the Song of Roland or the Nibelungenlied, one cannot feel that the equally long gestation of the Homeric epics in an illiterate period or pre-literate period produced in the end anything very close to real events. The question, however, as to the degree to which the Iliad preserved the memory of an actual Trojan War, therefore, is a kind of misguided one. It distracts us from the real issue. What is really significant in the present connection that I'm trying to make between later historical writing and its Homeric predecessors is the problem whether Homer intended to write history. And as I've already said, any effort to answer this issue affirmatively seems to me both to warp the nature of history itself and to slur his poetic genius. His own works carry within them the disproof of the proposition. To broaden out the grounds on which a proper judgment can be made, all we need to do is set Homer within his context of the Dark Ages, that period of time, as I said, from, say, roughly 1100 BC to 700 BC. That this was a simple world, a naive world, is shown by the scanty archaeological material of the period, as well as by Homer's own description of the ways of life of his heroes. Earlier in the Dark Ages, some great sites, such as Corinth, had been deserted even by that point for a very long time. Others, like Argos and Athens, had been continuously inhabited, but only by agricultural villages, nomads, and shepherds and that sort of thing. Down to almost the end of the 8th century, religious shrines were tiny huts. The working of figures in clay or bronze was by this date just passing beyond the rudely conventional into more consciously conceived small sculptures. Society was structured to some degree, and certainly between the ruling class and the ruled. Anyone cast out by his local group was without public protection, an outlaw who had to beg the support of some foreign, either chieftain or tribe. A modern observer thrown back suddenly into this world would certainly feel himself in an utterly primitive kind of place. If we are to hope to understand how Homer and his contemporaries might have thought about history, we must not bring with us that attitude which Reinhold Niebuhr sums up so well when he says, "In modern culture, both time and history are regarded as self-explanatory. They do not require explanation, but become the principle of explanation by which life is given meaning." This is an advanced concept, as can be shown by several independent lines of evidence. For example, children do not appear to grasp the irreversibility of time until they are about 5 years old. Only thereafter do they gain a sense of continuity. In other and there are other examples that one could look at in terms of anthropological studies that show that this is the case in kind of more primitive tribes. And only against this background can one hope to assess the bearing of Homer and the myths with respect to history. Homer's views of space, time, and the nature of man, as molded by his poetic genius within a stylized framework, have only an ancestral relationship with those of true history, which appeared centuries later in Hellenic development. In Greek myth, again, even events which take place in a world which has its own space and time, and they are, in this regard, very much like what we read about in Homer. In this matter, there is no need, really, for elaborate demonstration and quotation of mythical examples, which come easily to anyone's mind who's read Greek myth. What does deserve note, however, is the fact that mythical remembrances were far less bound by form than were the epic poets, and therefore their tales could evolve and change over the generations. And so it is the more significant that the earliest discernible levels of mythology, especially those connected with Heracles, are as unhistorical in nature as are the Homeric epics. There is then no reason to expect that the Greeks who lived in the undeveloped society of the Dark Ages from 1100 to 700 BC were historically conscious, unless one yields uncritical adherence to that ever-persuasive tendency to idealize the Homeric world as the forerunner of classical civilization. Nor was the era itself likely to have produced contemporary history or even historical records. Down into the 8th century, the Greek world was an amorphous mass of ethnoi, of peoples, whose leaders, basileis, or kings, were little more than military chieftains, hunting, cattle raiding, tilling the fields, listening to rhapsodes or bards. These were the occupations of life. Not until the city-state arose, in the archaic period, were there to be conscious internal conflicts or external aggrandizements which could prove the spur to historical records and memories, and therefore history. From the point of view, then, of the present investigation, the main legacy of myth and epic to later centuries may be taken as a fundamentally unhistorical attitude. For centuries to come, the deeds of the Olympian deities and of heroes such as Heracles, Theseus, or figures of the Trojan War were the main stuff of art and literature. The generalized, idealized mode of treatment which commonly prevailed accords completely with a picture of an archaic mentality which cannot accept what is individual and preserves only what is exemplary. Yet it will not do to take a further step in that direction and to say that this mentality is anti-historical. We don't want to go that far. Because there never, even though it was not historical, it was not anti-historical. And quite to the contrary, seeds of a potentially historical spirit may be found in the body of epic poetry and mythology, which we have so far considered in its non-historical aspects. And a few examples will suffice to suggest what I mean by this. The first is that one requirement of history is respect for the evidence, a requirement which certainly lay heavily on Homer. As a rhapsode, a bard, he stitched together inherited materials, and his warrior audience gave him little freedom with which to invent anew as far as the facts of the tale were concerned. The past of which he chanted had no direct connection with the present in which he and his listeners lived, but towards its great heroes he maintained an objective approach, a fundamental prerequisite for later historical attitudes. Objectivity, however, need not entail the loss of sympathy for the men who struggled and eventually died in his poem. And this quality, together with an underlying optimism, pervades the epic portrayal. We will soon see that there came a second great poet of early Greece, Hesiod, who was to construct a scheme of successive races, moving from a golden age to a silver age, and then on to an age of heroes, and then to the present age of iron. And even the myths which the Greeks told to themselves to account for their background did have a fundamentally logical, non-magical, and sequential quality to them. Theories of direct opposition to history, such as an irreversible, such as the idea that history, that the past could be changed, that does not fit into Greek thought. Who they did understand the irreversibility of the flow of events from its earliest level onward, even though much still had to be achieved truly before a genuine historical attitude could emerge. In other ways, as well, the inheritance from epic and myth favored, or at least directed, an emergence of a historical consciousness, a historical spirit. As in epic and myths, one also finds in the pottery of the 8th century a kind of logical ordering and analysis, as it were, of shapes and designs. And the epics provided models of extended narrative, cast in supple language in which the heroes were portrayed dramatically, and not just as puppets on a screen, but what happened to them must be explained, and their significance must be at least adumbrated. Above all, the Iliad and the Odyssey dealt with human beings, moved no doubt by the gods, but somehow possessed of human passions, ambitions, sensitivities, sufferings, experiences, and this anthropos-centered quality of Greek civilization. Many have remarked upon it, but it is really one of the most distinguishing features of the Greek genius. Other cultures in the ancient world worshipped crocodiles and birds and so on. But for the Greeks, even the gods themselves were men and women, because they saw anthropos as the highest thing on earth, and therefore they portrayed their gods in that form. And likewise, the subject of all of their arts, their statues, one thinks of the great statues of the classical period, or even of their philosophy and Socrates and the ethical concerns, the political concerns. Their focus was always upon man. Okay. And that quality is certainly to be found within the Homeric poems, and it would soon manifest itself in these other arts that I've just expressed. And therefore, when the first student of man's history, Herodotus, appeared, his single model, his single major model, was Homer. Epic and myths sum up, therefore, the literary inheritance from the earliest formative stage of Greek civilization. But this is not the only strand which helped to shape the Hellenic future. The Near East, as I said at the outset, did have civilized centers in Egypt and Mesopotamia, and those had existed for millennia, thousands of years going back. In fact, it is a staggering thought to consider that the amount of time that separates us from the ancient Greeks themselves was precisely the same amount of time that separated the ancient Greeks from the days of the pharaohs and the earliest period of time with the Egyptians. So talking about an incredibly old civilization in Egypt and, as I said, also in Mesopotamia. Um, Even the worst of the invasions and upheavals at the close of the Bronze Age, quite which threw the political, religious, and cultured life of those areas into disarray, even they did not succeed in totally demolishing this ancient civilization. During the 8th century, the Assyrian imperialists united much of the Near East politically, and there was a kind of a cultural koine, to import a later term, which became evident and had a strong influence even as far west as the Etruscans in Italy. The Greeks were in contact with this polished society well before 700 BC. Among the most critical questions in the rise of Greek civilization is the one of the extent to which the Aegean drew upon the far more developed world to its east and the manner in which Greek culture transmuted its borrowings. If the Near East did have a sense of history, which is a doubtful possibility in most areas, it nevertheless does not follow that the Greeks borrowed it, or at least borrowed a mature, ordered concept of historical composition. On this aspect, we may be very brief, simply because the debate doesn't really bear that much on our topic. A neat paradox does emerge when one considers the relations of the Aegean and the Near East, insofar as the Greek form of history owed nothing really to Eastern models. And the Greeks would not have written, and yet the Greeks would not have written history had they not been in contact with the states and cultures of the East, particularly Persia. But even before that, first of all, Near Eastern historiography proper, and here the modern historian is likely to think of that remarkable variety of records on which we can now draw to form a fairly continuous account of the progress of Near Eastern states over the millennia. There are treaties, for instance, between Ramses II of Egypt and the Hittite Hattusilisis of the Third. There are state correspondence, there are complaints and petitions, and many other forms of documentary evidence. Such materials, however, were not intended to be formal accounts of present and past events. Those must be found elsewhere. For instance, in Egypt, there were lists of kings, which were kept from the Old Kingdom onward, genealogies of priests, such as the Memphite priests, and during the height of the New Kingdom and its militarism, the middle and later centuries of the second millennium, the temples of Karnak and elsewhere display great reliefs of the royal victories with hieroglyphic texts, providing details of the number of enemy killed, beasts seized, and so on. Private tombs, of course, recount the deeds of the generals and administrators of Pharaoh. And from the contemporary Hittite world, also survive an account of the accession to power, as I said, of King Hattusilis III, and what may be called a chronicle of events, basically. Omen lists and annual chronicles preserve many details of the rise of the Assyrian Empire and wars of which are depicted the wars of which are depicted in the graphic reliefs of Khoraspad and Nineveh. Now, To call this varied corpus history is difficult, if not impossible, although lists of kings and eponymous magistrates from Egypt and Mesopotamia do show a sense of continuity, as well as being practically useful. They are in and of themselves not history. The decorations of temple walls or the erection of steles within the temples, that is kind of monument inscription stones, are essentially an accounting to the gods for their earthly favors to the rulers. Even the Assyrian annals, which are the fullest such records, are primarily of this class. In assessing the Near Eastern historical materials, therefore, we must distinguish sharply between their historical utility to modern students and the intent of their composers. In secular reports, and I put that term, of course, in quotation marks, it is difficult to see more than vainglorious boasting on the gratitude to divine patrons. A sober desire to describe the past analytically does not appear, and that is, of course, what history is. Since the accounts of the origins of the world in various kinds, which are the closest thing to anything really historical that we've got here, are always couched in the most grotesque mythical terms. In only one case can this view be seriously questioned, and that, of course, is the historical books of the Bible, the Hebrew Bible. Modern students of historiography commonly find themselves embarrassed to assess this material because of its strongly theological twist that the putatively more enlightened people of the modern day age don't believe in. But this will not do, okay, because there are so many moments inside of the Old Testament where the facts that are portrayed of history are absolutely confirmed by archaeology, such as the finding of Egyptian war chariots at the bottom of the Red Sea, or the Sennacherib prison, which describes the events with the destruction of Sennacherib, or the Moab inscription and describing the wars with the Moabites and so on. There's so many examples of this that it is very challenging for any atheistic or secular interpreter of the Old Testament to try to seriously challenge the historicity of it. Now, no one can see that the propensities elsewhere in the Near East to make lists of rulers, to set up pious records of royal achievements, or to create romances attributed to real characters had any serious weight in Greek thinking. Eventually, the Greeks, too, were to draw up lists of Athenian archons, priestesses of Hera at Argos, kings of Sparta, and so on, but it appears unlikely that they did so under outside impulse. Nor did Greek history begin with the initial step of writing these simple annals. Near Eastern theological schemes, such as we find in Hittite writing, in Babylonian writing, or in Egyptian writing, and Near Eastern myths were occasionally drawn upon in Greece. Hesiod, of course, toward the end of maybe perhaps the middle towards the end of the 7th century. He seems to have known some Near Eastern myths, and they certainly do have a lot in common in terms of the intergenerational violence between the various gods that is so characteristic of his theogony. He also seems to have picked up on the idea of man's past falling into distinct stages. That seems to be indebted to Near Eastern thought. But nevertheless, in terms of history, there really is not much that can really be explained in terms of indirect influence with the historical outlook that Greece would evolve. Some effort, nevertheless, has been made to assert a significant indebtedness to Herodotus to Persian tales, namely that the father of history, Herodotus, made use of a Persian list of satraps and of Egyptian inscriptions as far as they were translated for him. That is patent. That is true because he talks about it himself. And nevertheless, though, he goes further by parading Persian sources for the tales of woman stealing between Asia and Europe that begin his history. So there's other examples too of where he says, yes, this is what the Persians say. Now, whether Herodotus was serious in his introduction there, whether it was simply designed to gain attention as a kind of captatio benevolentiae, that is more doubtful. In any case, as one thoughtful critic has noted, the political opposition between the two continents, evident in that opening section, could scarcely have emerged before Herodotus's own lifetime, and is therefore much more likely to be of a Greek rather than a Persian origin. Even though fact and romantic tale in Herodotus's manifold recounting of events may occasionally have had Eastern origins, we do find it, I think, sensible to conclude that the pattern of the first Greek history is Hellenic, especially when we return to, and we will see this in particular when we return to Herodotus in several lectures' time, after surveying the developments of archaic Greece more generally. The idea of history, as the Greeks were to develop it, therefore, had no intrinsic connection to the Near East. But the paradox that I mentioned a moment ago still stands. Herodotus's history could never have been written if the Near East had not existed. And there it comes, the fact that there is and it was from the East, actually, that a vital mechanical tool first took place, and that is the alphabet. The Mycenaean world had used a syllabary, okay, the kind of writing that they, linear B that they wrote was not an alphabet, it was a syllabary, a syllabic script, which died out as the palace economies of the end of the Bronze Age dissolved. Across the Dark Ages, the Aegean was illiterate until at some point, probably in the very, very late 8th century, or perhaps even slightly earlier, some voyager to the Syrian coast picked up and brought back the Phoenician alphabet. Although the names and largely the shapes of the individual letters remained Phoenician, the Greeks introduced signs for vowels that were different, and therefore they made the alphabet a supple tool for writing poetry. The Homeric epics must thus have been set down not long after their final formulation. When prose appeared, as in treaties and public records, it too could be written without serious difficulty and read by the growing literate upper classes of the Greek states. Despite the fact that the Chinese were able to develop history in a cumbrous script, not with an alphabet, the presence and ever greater use of the alphabet must have facilitated the rise of both Greek history as a science and also ultimately of philosophy, the greatest achievement of the Greek mind. In the second place, the venerable massive monuments and evolved societies of the Near East awakened in the simple Greeks of this time who came to Syria and Egypt in ever greater numbers two great streams of thought, which led on to more conscious historical meditation. Full consideration of this important aspect will be reserved for a later lecture, but I just want to give you two specific figures that may serve as brief illustrations. One is named Hecataeus, standing in front of a long array of wooden statues of past Theban priests. He represents one side of this meditation, which spurred the Greeks to visualize earlier times as long and historical. And of course, the second is Herodotus, who was busily noting his impressions of alien peoples on his wide travels throughout the Eastern world. Homer had drawn little cultural or racial distinction between Trojans and Greeks. In his time, as Thucydides observes, quote, the Hellenes were not yet known by one name, and so marked off as something separate from the outside world. This very comment throws into relief the distinction which was evident by Thucydides' own day, the late 5th century. Actually, awareness of difference between East and West, and therewith a deeper comprehension of the basic unity of Hellenic culture, grew steadily across the period of 700 to 500 BC. An almost inevitable historical question to follow was the source of the difference, a problem which rose into real significance once the Greeks and Persians were thrown into extensive hostile contact. Both the travels of Herodotus and the history which came from it came from those travels can be understood only in terms of this awareness. The Greek world was steadily moving toward a great explosion in the decades just on either side of 700, which was to throw Greeks over almost all the shores of the Mediterranean and to produce in a rush large-scale sculpture, temples, lyric poetry, and the more conscious, tighter organization of the polis, the city-state. Homer composed his epics before this tremendous upheaval. The next great figure in Greek literature lived during this most critical period, but so much to one side that he does not fully reflect all its aspects, and this is Hesiod, who was from Askra, in a village overlooking the plain of Boeotia. Since this poet journeyed to Chalcas to commemorate the death of a king for whom there is other evidence, we can actually place him at around, as I said, definitely in the 7th century, and maybe even in the first half of the 7th century at his earliest, but it might be slightly later. He uses Greek epic hexameter poetry, just like Homer had done, and that links him more with Homer than with the lyric poets of the next century. Besides a great volume of poetry, surviving only in fragments and not likely to be Hesiod's own works, two major poems do bear his name and that are authentic, the Works and Days and the Theogony. And these furnish intriguing evidence which sometimes accords with that of Homer and sometimes stands sharply in sharp distinction. The Works and Days is one of the most fascinating and amazing products of certainly early Greek literature and arguably all Greek literature. When Hesiod's father died, we learn in this poem, his elder wicked brother Perses conspired with the bribe-swallowing basileis, that is, chieftains, to take most of the inheritance. Hesiod, inspired to poetry by the muses themselves in his native Helicon, responded with a lengthy exhortation against injustice. The cause of the poem is a specific real event, therefore, a real event in the present day, not a legendary tale. Also un-Homeric is Hesiod's effort to explain the injustices of the contemporary world, the origins of which he, of course, sought in the past, and therefore recounted the myth of Pandora, sent by Zeus to plague man for having gained the boon of fire. But then he gives an alternative explanation, namely that mankind has passed through 5 successive races, those of gold, silver, bronze, heroes, and then of iron. And men never rest from labor or sorrow by day and from perishing by night. End quote. The concept of races Hesiod probably, as I said before, borrowed from the Near East, but he altered it to accord with the reality, as Epic had told him to do, of an age of heroes, nobler and more righteous, a godlike race of hero men known as demigods, the race before our own, he says. The generations of man are discontinuous, therefore, rather than intimately connected. And modern men, accustomed to ideas of progress, as we are in our own society, may feel Hesiod has turned the past upside down. And it's an interesting fact that basically all throughout the entire world, in ancient times, the ancient Mediterranean world, the classical world, it was an unwritten assumption that things were once better and then had gotten worse and continued to get worse. This is in very, very stark contrast to the modern liberal notion of progress that is really, gripped Western mind, the Western mind since the Enlightenment. As we oftentimes hear, the arc of history is long, but it tends towards justice. That kind of liberal optimism about the nature of history, that is completely the opposite of what the classical world understood to be the case, namely that things were one time better and then have continually gotten worse over time. Apart from its inception in a real event and the theory of human stages, however, Hesiod's Works and Days reveal almost as unhistorical an attitude as do the Homeric epics. The source is a real event, and Hesiod firstly distinguishes false from true. Yet he gives no details of his lawsuit with Perseus and swiftly raises his whole poem to a plane of generalization about the causes and results of injustice. For Zeus will punish the evil and reward the good. From this, he passes to a manual on agricultural life, that is the works part of the poem, and then to a mass of magical wisdom on good and bad days, that's the days part of the poem, on what to do on certain days of the month, and which days are lucky and which ones are not. Hesiod does know and describes the seasons. He divides man's life into 5 stages. He even gives the name of one month, the Lanaion, but his poem has little sense of time in general. The word chronos only appears once. Early in the next poem of his, the subsequent poem, the Theogony, the muses of Helicon tell Hesiod that, quote, we know how to speak many false things as though they were true, but we know when we will to utter true things, end quote. A sliding allusion, presumably, to the Homeric epics. Then the muses give the poet, quote, a divine voice to celebrate things that shall be and things that were aforetime, end quote. And this he proceeds to employ for over 1,000 lines to chronicle the generations of the gods from chaos onwards, together with the birth of earth, the hills, heaven, Gaia, Uranos, ocean, other physical features. Students of Greek philosophy have oftentimes emphasized the significance of this first study in cosmogony, which is entirely not a rational presentation of things. It is an appeal to myth. Okay, but the point to take away from all of this is that neither in Homer nor in Hesiod can we detect a consciously historical attitude. If anything, one's survey of these epics and the myths that lay behind them suggests that Hesiod knew how difficult it would be for the Greeks, inclined to idealize and to explain the world by divine intervention on every level, from the muses of a fountain to the gods of Mount Olympus. How difficult it would be ultimately to develop a historical spirit. That is the big kind of overriding suggestion that comes from doing a survey of these authors. Often the visual impact of artistic evidence best throws into salient relief major qualities of Greek civilization. And concluding my presentation right now, I would just like to invite a kind of a description of the of a vase that came from this early time. It is an amphora, and it depicts the corpse of a man lying on its funeral couch with a coverlet displayed above. A wife and child stand at its head. Friends and relatives raise their hands in grief, while musicians accompany their wails, and the warriors are far to the left, poised to take away the bier. The event is real. We neither know, however, the name of the dead, nor have any clues as to his historical position. The painter of this scene, which comes from this time, certainly could have thought in the manner of the sculptors of Trajan's column later on, and given a much more realistic kind of depiction of things. At this time, Assyrian sculptors were depicting the glories of their warlords in very realistic relief. But this potter from Attica knows nothing of such ideas. The artist is saying something which has significance, therefore. Viewed as a rendering of life, it is a solemn scene reduced to its barest terms, terms telling from their very bareness. Here is an artist who has not attempted more than he could exactly perform, an art not childish, but planned and austere. And this fits very well with Homer. Artist and poet alike come from a world that is, we might say, simpler in some ways. Even though both suggest the great possibilities latent within the Hellenic pattern of thought. Man and his deeds are at the center. though as yet conceived almost abstractly. When finally the expanding Greek world had developed more conscious ideas of space and time, and had evolved a political framework which spurred, even demanded, historical accounts of the past, these drew primarily in their ultimate root from the native Greek development of the Dark Ages. To return to the visual level, one need only compare such a scene with the later developments of the scene that I've depicted in its kind of earliest kind of archaic simplicity to the later developments of the classical area to see the same kind of transformation that would take place. How the later historical development would be far more specific, conscious, and immediately comprehensible than its very early forerunner. Thank you.